Welcome. The session is on Article 31, and I was reminded by my compatriot Steve Esty yesterday that all of us who work in CRPD all have our favorite sections and say, this is the section, this article is the important one. Well, I have to say that indeed this article is the important one, and I'm not making that up. Just as a preamble and give you some idea of what I propose to do, I'm going to pass the little black book which is right here. The issue with data, which seems absolutely flat out the most boring thing you could imagine, is actually fundamental to the characteristic of the CRPD, which makes it a distinctive document. It makes it a document which is, in many ways, revolutionary. You notice I don't use the P word to describe that. Revolutionary and transformative is that it is consistent with what we in the policy business called evidence-based policy. That is, the difference between having policy which is effectively rhetorical, in which you say, human rights now, I want the human rights approach, I want equality, and using terms which are politically, rhetorically effective, and I'm certainly not demeaning political activism in the rhetorical sense, because God knows it gets the work done. The reason we have the CRPD is because of that. But at some point, as the eminent disability sociologist Irving Zola said many years ago with respect to the ADA, at some point you have to move the rhetoric into evidence. You have to make the changes that you are suggesting concrete, and you have to implement them, and moreover, not just implement them, you have to ensure that they have a consistent status, that they become universal in the policy of the country or the world. So the CRPD and its effectiveness depends on its implementation, which is not a magnificently revolutionary claim to make, but its implementation depends not on its rhetorical force, but as its potential for evidence-based policy. Now that requires two steps, and if you notice was the first person to speak and the last person to speak. I am the bookends of summer school, and I started out with what we would call conceptual clarification. Looking at these terms, these lovely normative terms like equality, and giving some sense to them, which we call the process of operationalization, turning these terms into things ultimately that are measurable, so that you know that societies are becoming more and more equal. You have to make more into something which is, if not quantitatively robust, at least comparative. We have gone from this state to that state, and that is an improvement. That is progressive. That has moved us in a direction. You can only make that claim if you have some mechanism for doing so, and you can only have that mechanism be successful if you have data, if you have evidence, if you have something in which you can use to make an argument to a policymaker, to a government, that things have gotten worse or things have gotten better. It's a trivial point, but it's absolutely essential. So I'm going to talk about two things. Article 31 is by focus, talking about the nature of data in general, disability data in specific, and indicators. What an indicator is and what a human rights indicator would look like. Where we are with respect to the science of human rights indicators. And as my good friend and colleague Tom Shakespeare tells me, the distinctive mark of an academic is in the paper that an academic writes, you have 80% that outlines the problems, and at the end you say, oh, well, maybe there are solutions, but I don't care about that. The problems are too interesting. Well, unfortunately, this talk is going to be in that mode because I want to look at, of course, I don't call them problems, I call them challenges and opportunities. I'm going to look at the challenges and opportunities we have with respect to disability data, collecting it, making sense of it, and also the problems and challenges for making sense of human rights indicators. Human rights indicators are a new breed of entity. In the past, an indicator, GDP is the grandfather of all indicators. It's a function, the indicator development comes out of social indicators literature, which is primarily economic. We are co-opting, revolutionizing, and paradigmizing indicators for our use in human rights. So this is, in a sense, a revolutionary move itself to have something which we could legitimately call a human rights indicator. The progress I'm going to look at first give us a roadmap, a terrain map of the territory of 31 and 33, repeating and reprising some stuff that has come up before. Data, the simple truths, most of which are problems and, challenges and opportunities. Indicators, what they are, and then the challenge and opportunity of human rights indicators. Okay, this is Article 31, and as I did before, this is the way I taught in law school. You give the article, and then you start underlining things and highlighting things. Because this article is, well, as I said, the most important one in the convention, has certain salient features to it that I want to emphasize. The first thing to emphasize is the stuff in bold, appropriate information, including statistical and research data, is not free-floating. It is wedded to a specific application, namely data. For what purpose? To enable them, states parties, to formulate and implement policies to give effect to the present convention. 31 links together, welds together, data collection, statistics, and a particular purpose, monitoring the implementation. The subsections under 1 talk about certain internationally accepted forms on privacy and data protection and confidentiality. And under 2, a term which I will explain in some detail because this term, disaggregation, which sounds like something that has to do with intestinal blockage, but actually has to do with what data you need to show discrimination. You absolutely need disaggregated data, or else you cannot make the case for or against the presence or absence of discrimination. So it's a very important technical term, but I'll give you a detechnicalization of it. And lastly, the important part of data is not for experts, it's not for policy wonks such as myself. It has to be disseminatable, I'm inventing words today, disseminatable and accessible. It's because the primary recipients and beneficiaries of this data, which is wedded to the implementation of the convention, are people with disabilities. I'm not going to go through Article 33 in too much detail because other people have. It sets up the responsibilities of implementation and monitoring for states parties, the identification of focal points, coordination mechanisms, and independent mechanisms for promoting, protecting, and monitoring. We have seen this before, but let me just give you a cleverly done table with animation, which I'm still practicing. Sometimes I have a slide up and I said, I thought I put other stuff on that slide. And then I thought, oh, I have to do that. Isn't that wonderful? 33.1 creates or identifies focal point and coordination mechanism. 33.2 gives us implementation monitoring mechanism. And 33.3, as I understand it, shows the absolute core linkage between the two and the facilitation between the two of persons with disabilities. So the persons with disabilities and their role is not peripheral ad hoc, it is central, it's integrated within this mechanism. And where is 31? Well, 31 is a servant or implementation or a means to this apparatus. So that is where it figures in, providing data and statistics. I use MDAC's analysis of Article 33 in this book, which I highly recommend. It's available on their website, Building the Architecture for Change. It's a very, very good introduction to some of the issues of 33. Okay, that is the terrain. That's where we're working from. Now, some simple truths about data and the challenges. And I'm going to be slightly provocative in some ways because what I do to provoke is to get us to think. I mean, that's the nature of what we're here for. And unfortunately, the best way to provoke is to say rubbish and nonsense that everyone thinks is wrong. But in the course of thinking it wrong, they go through a certain cerebral roadmap in which we learn together. And that's what I want to do for the next couple of slides. Rosemary was kind enough to know that the number here in the denominator is 76, which seems like a long, but don't worry, it'll go. You won't even notice it. It'll be painless, let me assure you. There are two kinds of data. There are several other kinds, but we're only looking at qualitative data and quantitative data. Now, qualitative data is a fairly new entity, and it's typically data that refers to aspects of situations, often personally related aspects, therefore feelings, qualities, or other kinds of dimensions of situations that are reported by an individual. And their primary feature, well, there are two features to it. One, it's rich, because it's primarily narrative rather than quantitative. So it's rich, full of nuance, full of the need to interpret. But it's also not easily represented in numerical form. There are methodologies, sophisticated statistical methodologies for transforming qualitative into quantitative data, using what is called rash analysis and other multivariant analyses, and you can feel blessed that I'm not going to talk about those things. Quantitative data is quantitative data. We have a nice feel for it, and I'm not going to spend much time about it. This is information about people and the context in which people act and do their lives, their employment relationships, their family relationships, and the rest of it, but it's data about us, about people. And there are some things about this data which make it problematic. If we're talking about data about atoms or chemicals, we wouldn't have these problems, or not as badly. But when we're talking about data about people, it's hard to get this data, invariably expensive, a feature which will come back to haunt us. It is hard, well, not hard, it is multi-interpretable. That is to say, it's data which is open to interpretation. Even the most quantitative data is data that has nuances built into it because people are complex entities and information about people is complex and interpretable. And it's open to challenges, to the two most important challenges that data is susceptible to. That it's not true to what it's supposed to be identifying, invalid, or it's not reproducible, in the sense that two people looking at the same phenomena would come up with two different kinds of information. We say that's unreliable. So information, to be good information, has to obviously be true to what it's talking about. Otherwise, it's not information in a sense. But it also has to be reproducible in the sense that many people can rely on it because it is not a feature of one individual's interpretation of a setting. Now, there's nothing invalid or uninteresting about one person's interpretation. That's, in fact, the basis for qualitative data. But when you're using the data in an intersubjective context, when you are trying to make decisions about how to organize society, how to allocate resources, you need information that is reliable in the sense that it doesn't matter where you sit in order to determine whether it's true or not. You have to make the, I'm not going to use the word objective because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about intersubjective, so that when I and Carly look at the same phenomena, we're going to have a we're going to have a mechanism where we can come to an agreement about what we're seeing. Then we have information we can work with. Intersubjective reliability. Now, there are arguments to say that validity simply is intersubjective reliability, and that's plausible. There are some arguments that go the other way. If you have validity, then reliability is simply implied by that. But whatever, since we're talking about data about human beings, about us, both of these are phenomena that are challenging. Not overwhelming in the challenge, but challenging. Okay, why? There's the implicit hierarchy between kinds of data. Quantitative data is, quote, scientific. It is impressive in the sense that people say, oh, good heavens, the GDP of this country is X, Y, Z. And people are impressed by that because it's something about the world. It's firm, it's the rest of it. And it has direct impact on policy. Let me assure you, let me just give an example. It's about disability, but it's phenomenal. The World Report on Disability, which the World Health Organization launched about 5 months ago, has in Chapter 2 an epidemiological study of the prevalence, worldwide prevalence of disability. The chapter is long, complicated, and technical, but its design was designed to do one thing: to change a number which in 1976 the World Health Organization produced about the number of people in the world who were disabled at 10%, a number which was invented by 7 people around a table one day after coffee when the question is, what do you think the prevalence is worldwide? Oh, I don't know, it's 6. Oh, it's higher than that. It's about 11, don't you think? Oh, I don't know. When's coffee? Let's call it 10, which actually was not a very scientific procedure. But the number 10%, you can read that number in every bloody UN document you pick up from 1977 to 2006. In fact, it's still there. What is the prevalence? It's 10%. Bullshit, as my American cousins would say. No, it's not. The second chapter of the World Report on Disability gives a methodology for showing that it's between 13 and 18% worldwide. And every country who had fairly good census data, say my country in Canada, knew that it wasn't 10. Even a high-resource country which doesn't have problems of health care and various other things knew that the prevalence of disability was certainly not 10, higher than that. But that number has had direct impact on policy because it is the number from which policy significance is derived. If you do policy, these numbers are absolutely crucial. If the prevalence rate is 10%, one kind of policy regime is conceived. If it's 15, a different one is conceived. A different level of seriousness, a different level of political sensitivity, etc. These numbers have an impact far beyond, perhaps, what they should have, but they do. Unfortunately, there's an implicit problem with quantitative information, and that is it's numerical, and that level of precision is often completely artificially contrived. So what we call false precision. 10%, wow, let's see, how many people in our country divided by 10? Well, oh, it comes out to, and you get down right to one incredibly precise number. No. The quantitative data that we're talking about is going to be data involving ranges. So the inherent problem with quantitative data is that it's falsely precise. It's also falsely transparent. There's a lovely book that people who do statistics always point to, How to Lie with Statistics. And everyone who has ever done anything in quantitative work knows this. There's something about quantitative data that seems so reliable and transparent, but actually is easily manipulated. Qualitative data has two important features. Starting with the obvious, it is a voice for people with disabilities. Qualitative data allows or makes it possible for people to express their experiences, their narrative, what it is that makes their life what it's like. So qualitative data is extremely important, and it is implicit in the monitoring and indicator mechanism that is now being talked about, that some place has to be found for qualitative indicators. I will give you an example of it a little later on, but qualitative indicators is also a new animal on the block, so to speak, and it is very, very exciting, the possibility of these kinds of indicators. They're also realistic, relevant, and concrete. The thing about, I mean, if anyone has done qualitative research, and all the dream people seem to be doing qualitative research, so I'll speak to the dreamies in the audience. Qualitative research, if you ever do it, there's something about it, it's just nitty-gritty. It is real data. It's messy as hell. It needs a lot of interpretation, but you cannot doubt that it's concrete. It's a report of an experience. What could possibly be wrong with it? Well, there's something which I will call the SEN challenge. As soon as someone answers that phone. Oh, you got it? Okay. The SEN challenge is as follows. This is once again from Amartya Sen, who I mentioned on Monday. Amartya Sen did some work in India on the status of low-class Indian women, and his colleague at the time, Martha Nussbaum, as well. And he noticed something which he expressed it in a different way, involving what's called subjective health perceptions and whatnot. I'm going to shift it and put it in these terms. You know when oppression works, putting it in an odd way, you know when people are really oppressed when they agree that they are not very valuable. You know oppression has been successful when the oppressed individual does not perceive the oppression, but lives it and think it's normal. Sen recognized that if you ask what are called quality of life questions for low-class, low-caste Indian women, you have a surprising phenomena. Extremely high levels of quality of life. In fact, there's a lovely paper in which the highest levels of quality of life ever measured using standard quality of life instruments were in Mumbai, I think, amongst these women who actually, life expectancy of 27, living on a corner of a street, etc. Their quality of life was the highest recorded, I love this paper because it just fits into my ethnic background. The lowest quality of life ever reported was amongst New Jersey Jewish women, because they were always saying, I never go on vacations. We always go to the same. The quality of life was abysmal amongst wealthy Jewish women in New Jersey. Now, what's going on? Well, it's very straightforward. Quality of life measures the gap between expectation and reality. If you expect shit and you get it, you're happy. Quality of life is very high if you reach your expectations. Jewish women in New Jersey have expectations through the ceiling. They will never realize them. Life is always substandard if your expectations are lunar, if they're so high that you're always failing. If you're oppressed, you believe that that's a good life. That is what oppression is, really. It is being lowered to a subhuman level and accepting that as normality. So Sand objects, there is something we have to be careful about in qualitative self-report narrative. Namely, there is no good reason for thinking that people with disabilities will be able to identify discrimination, ill treatment, or mistreatment, or abuse. Because if they're successfully discriminated against, they will not notice it, because they will accept that that's normality. So Sand says, be very careful with qualitative information about an oppressed group, because there's no good reason to think they don't have false consciousness, as a good Marxist like myself would call it. Namely, that they have not absorbed the oppression that has been visited on them and think it's the way life should be. If you have an individual who has been, a friend of mine, now deceased, Pat Worth in Canada, who lived his entire life in an institution, if you asked this person, would you like to make decisions for yourself, the answer would be, what does that mean? Of course not. I mean, why would I make decisions about my own life? This is my life. This is normal. Other people making decisions for me. You cannot expect that individual to leap out with full-blown disability consciousness. Aha! Article 12, now I'm liberated. Because if you're oppressed, you don't know it. That's what oppression is like when it's successful. So, a long story, but it's a problem with disability qualitative information. You cannot immediately assume that a person who is oppressed, whether it's gender oppression or racial or religious or disability, knows that their expectations should be higher. I'm sure you want to discuss this, but I have to move on. No, I don't. Go ahead. Yeah, we need I know this is... Okay, the second point I want, or third, as it happens, when I just did something very strange. Hang on. Gracious me. Well, I moved to disability data, and I'm not entirely sure. More technically, where do we get disability data from? Well, we get it from these sources. Censuses, which have their problems. Thematic populations. This is the real sources of data that we have. Health, what are so-called thematic population surveys in health, social and economic, employment. Administrative records, that is, say, the records that are found associated with different kinds of disability policies. Research findings provide information, And what are called event-based documentations, the sort of thing that Eric Rosenthal is doing actually is a source of disability data with respect to particular events, individuals in certain kinds of circumstances. These are our primary sources, well actually all of our sources of the kind of data that could be called disability data. But as I say, this is epidemiology on one slide. There's only one thing or two things you need to know about epidemiology, which is a nice long word, but it's only prevalence and incidence. And I put it in here because I realized I needed it later on. And actually I needed it right from the beginning with my example. Prevalence is the number of individuals at a particular time or span of time that are alive. So the prevalence of disability is the number of individuals with disabilities at a certain point in time. And incidence is a rolling event of when the occurrence of new cases, say through accidents or the birth of individuals with congenital disabilities. So it's looking at whether the numbers are increasing. People who survive, of course, become part of prevalence. So just keep those two terms in line. So some simple truths about disability data. Of those instruments that I say we get the disability data from, the primary problem and our biggest challenge is the data that we actually have to work with is impairment-based. Now what that means is that the questions that are asked in censuses, surveys, and other instruments, questionnaires or whatever, don't understand the model of disability which is involved in the convention. There are some exceptions that are coming online, but historically, the kind of questions that you get in, say, censuses look like that. This is the 1981 census, the so-called disability question in Pakistan. Are you blind, deaf? No, I always forget the preamble. If, God forbid, I'm quoting, if, God forbid, you have a disability, are you? A little prejudicial in the way it's set up. Blind, deaf and dumb, crippled, mentally retarded, insane, other? So the feature about this question, besides the fact that it's prejudicial and inflammatory in its language, is that it's impairment-based. It is looking at the impairment, not the disability. Now, need it be said, that that's our conception of disability. Our conception of disability is the impairment, blindness, lack of visual acuity, whatever you want to call the impairments, interacting with the environment and producing a problem in employment. That's disability. A problem in employment is disability. Now, the instruments that we have to identify disability don't identify disability. They identify impairments. And historically, information about impairment was used to infer disability. So you count the number of people who are blind, and that is the number of people who have employment problems, etc. So the inference there is the environment is neither facilitating nor acting as a barrier. It's an automatic inference, which is scientifically problematic. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, I was looking for countries, I was sitting over there on the internet, looking for countries that we are holding up to praise. I couldn't find anything wrong with Canada. I tried. But Australia, a sophisticated country, in 2009, describes, this is not the questions in the questionnaire, it's the analysis of them, but it's okay because it's the same problem. What are the main disabling conditions? I would say prejudice, discrimination, those are the main. They say diseases of the muscular system and connective tissue, diseases of the circulatory. This is what I call an impairment-based census approach. where what you do is you identify, in this case, diseases, not even impairments, strictly speaking, diseases, and you use these to infer disability prevalence. So you go from diseases, which, I mean, there's no denying that if you have a spinal cord injury, you'll have a difficulty entering the, well, you would probably have not a problem at all with the Paralympics, racing down the street without your wheelchair. Yeah, you would have problems. But the problem is caused by the absence of a good wheelchair more or as much as the fact that you have paralysis below. So, although there is a relevance to impairment because of our model has impairment in it. So you can't say disability. See, I'm not a pure social model person because I think it's loony. You can't say that disability is entirely created by the environment. There's no medical condition at all, because that, or medical or functional problem, we call it that, because that would be actually be insulting to people with disabilities, because that would say, look, there's no reason why you can't walk. It's just social prejudice. Get up and walk. I mean, to my mind, that's insulting. Obviously, as Jenny Morris and other disability advocates have argued, the body is involved in disability. The body is fundamental to disability, which is another way of saying that these conditions, diseases of the respiratory system, if you have asthma, that is a phenomena which is relevant to disability. It isn't disability, but it's relevant to it. And to deny that is to my mind, just to be insulting to people with disabilities. But that's a different story too. Now, this chart, it's the only chart, so bear with me, comes from an organization called Stat, which is the UN's official statistics organization. And it's a selection of whatever that is, 30-odd countries, done by me, and since I'm colorblind, I have a difficult time finding contrasts that I can see. I can see this one, and if it's not, well, it's your problem if you can't see. But I have to be able to see it. This is a comparison of the results of those surveys in these countries, going from Syria at the low end to Norway at the high end, of what all of these countries called the prevalence, the number of existing, living, blah, blah, of severe disability in their countries. And if you look at this chart, what you'll see is that Syria has a prevalence of just under 2%, and Norway has a prevalence of about 32%. Now, as I tell people, and there are probably people in this room who have heard this joke, I have very few jokes, and I love them, so I tell them over and over. There are two messages we can learn from this. One, stay away from Norway. God, what a place. 1 out of 3 people have severe disability. It must be something in the water. Syria, it's heaven on earth. 2%, only 2% of the that's one message. The other message is they're not measuring the same thing. And this chart represents the bane of statistics in disability. The fact that disability, its definition is controversial, it's impairment-based typically. You pick your impairments, and also you pick the threshold of how severe they are. And every country, more or less, does it differently. So if you're looking for internationally comparable disability prevalence data, you're not going to find it. You may find it in 10 years, but you won't find it now. And the reason has to do with the definition and the operationalization, how you transfer that into a question, in a census. Well, just to give you some example, this is completely irrelevant, but I talked about it on Monday, and it's such a lovely picture that I thought I'd give it to you. The French below says what we call muscular dystrophy, la sclérodopaque. You can either resign yourself to it, or you can look for a solution in genetic research. Now this is, if I ever wanted a pure medical model, this is it. So we have a person who I claim is looking at her ankles, but other people say he's looking at the stairs, and I think it's just the ankles he's looking at. This person is in a wheelchair, and notice the options. You either resign yourself to it, oh, staircase, oh well, I can't get upstairs, or how's this going to help him? Either that, or you look for genetic research so that the people with that condition don't get born, presumably, or get repaired in vitro. I don't know what genetic research is going to do. Pure impairment-based medical model. Now, this picture is representing what's going on in most censuses in the world. We look for a medical condition called MS, and that tells us this person can't work because they can't get upstairs to the office. They have a disability. There's an inference from disease to disability. That is the problem in a nutshell. Now, let me give you some other examples of progress. We now, this stuff I just get all, sexually aroused by. I'm sure you won't. So just bear with me, because this language here is really, really interesting. We're seeing a series of steps away from the impairment-based to something much closer to an instrument which would actually collect data relevant to the convention. And this is our challenge, to find a technique, a survey methodological technique for doing it. This is from an early Irish census, not too early, but it's, do you have the following long-lasting conditions? So it's the impairment side. Question 15 is the impairment side. Divided up more or less the way Pakistan did, ironically. It's the deaf-blind cripple system, as we used to call it. Do you have blindness, a condition of potential basic activity? Okay, an ADL, activities of daily living question under B, learning disability, psychosocial disability, and the famous other, which I always say being born Jewish is probably should fit in there, but never mind about that. 16, if yes. So this, you may think, what's the difference? There is a difference. It's two parts. Instead of stopping with 15, you go on to ask, is there any link between this and your life? Because if you want a summary of what the CRPD conception of disability is, it's how are you living, not what do you have, but how are you living in the world. That's the conception. If yes to any of these questions, do you have problems? Now, what we have here are more activities rather than health conditions or impairments. Going outside, working at a job, participating in other activities. So there's an attempt to at least acknowledge that the impairment is not it alone, but the impairment interacting with something causes a difficulty at work. What is missing is another question saying, is there something about your workplace which makes it difficult for you to work? What we call environmental factor questions. There's a third question that needs to be asked. If you had all three, the impairment information would give you certain kinds of impairment needs, because people who are blind have certain kinds of medical and other requirements that people who have an ongoing health condition like diabetes have. So you just need to know that. I mean, it's irrelevant to knowing what sort of services and needs they have, but it's not disability. So you need to know it, but you need something else. You need to know the impact on a person's life, a question like in 16, but that's not going to help you with interventions. What you need to know is what's bringing about in the world. Is it people's attitudes that make it difficult for you to work? Is it the absence of assistive technology that makes it difficult to work? Is it staircases? What is it in the world that creates the difficulty? With those three things, we would have information. Well, here is now we're going to the pinnacle, Canada. This is called the Participation and Activity Limitation Survey, 2007. which is an attempt to make the next step. How much difficulty do you have hearing what is said in a telephone conversation? So the first thing to notice, it's not an impairment-based question. It's a difficulty in doing something, not do you have diabetes. So first of all, impairments disappear. But you really don't need them, because what you need are the things that interfere with your life, or rather, what you need is the interference in your life, not what medical condition you have. So there are other sections of this document which have medical conditions, by the way, so I'm being nice to Canada a bit. And then you say, do you use any aids, specialized equipment or services for persons who are deaf? I'm keeping in the field of hearing, such as, for example, a volume control, and then a list of AT, assistive technology. And cochlear implant is not an AT, but it's a, if you like, a response. Now, the PALS does not have, although there is actually another Canadian census question that the Quebec government has that then goes on to say, why don't you have these things? Or is there something else that is interfering with your life? This is it for PALS. I'm giving you this, I'm just giving you examples. The Washington City Group is the UN agency that is, or UN group that is looking at trying to get a model disability census question. And these are the ones that they're coming up with. Do you have difficulty seeing even if wearing glasses? So these are all attempts, maybe failures, but attempts to try to reach toward this interactive conception of disability. Using your usual customary language, you have difficulty communicating, for example, understanding or being understood by others. Interactive. Now, this result of 4 years of research comes up with 6 questions to try to get a standard disability prevalence around the world. And if you say 6, that seems like not enough. The average cost of adding 1 question to a census is $40,000. Adding 1 question. Adding 6, most countries of the world cannot afford. Just the mechanics of it. So that's always in the background here. Getting good data is not cheap. This is EdSIM, which I was privileged in the early days to work with. This is the European Module on Disability and Social Integration, which is going on stream in the European Union. So this will be across all the European Union countries to ask similar questions concerning disability in every country. Now, I'm not going to give you, do I give you questions? No, I don't. I just give you the headings of the questions. But notice all of these are what we call areas of participation. They're not impairments, they're not health conditions, they're areas of participation. Access to learning opportunities. Do you have access? That's as close as we've been able to come to environmental questions. Questions not about you and your impairments, but questions about the way the world is responding to you and your impairments. Mobility, transportation, community life, accessibility to. So this data would be, I suggest, disability data. This is relevant disability data. I do give some questions. I'm so sorry. But the questions I can't read. This is the internet one. Do you use internet from any other place? Blah, blah, blah. What's interesting is the bottom bit. You say, no, I don't use the internet. Why don't you use the internet? Okay? So the 8 headings underneath it are intended to capture the impact of the environment on your failure to be able to use the internet. Financial, too busy, lack of knowledge, well, health condition is there. So the impairment, I think this is correct, but you can disagree. The health condition comes in as a reason for not doing something, not as the cause of doing something. And the distinction seems hairline, but actually it makes a big difference because the fact that it's bundled up here means that a person can say, yeah, well, you know, the fact that I'm deaf does have an effect on my use of the internet, but what really has effect is I don't have the money to buy one. That's what really causes the problem, the computer. So at least bundled up in this fashion, the person is allowed, has the ability to convey to us the information in the world that limits them. And that, I submit, is disability. The lack of special aids or equipment. I don't allow questions in my lecture. Yes? We need a microphone? That's the problem. What? Some other, this is the employment one, which I really like. Are you limited in the type or amount of work that you do? And then if you are, why? Lack of job opportunities, family responsibilities, health condition, some other activity limitation, transport problem, access. The only one which is discriminatory in its focus is the second to last, or actually the second and third to last, employers' lack of flexibility. We tried to get in adverse co-worker attitudes and other sorts of there's a tendency to think that the only things which are preventing people from doing things are either physical objects or climate or something, when attitudes or inappropriate social benefit systems or very complicated may often be the things that are really interfering with a person's life. So, okay, enough of that. I'm not going, well, there's one here that's kind of sweet. How much choice do you have over how you spend your free time I would claim an Article 12 question. I'll let you think about that for a while. And this is one which I'm going to come back to because it's the only one on earth that I know of this sort, and it's relevant to the CRPD. Thinking about how other people tend to respond to you, would you say that you get respect and consideration from other people? Now, this question goes to the categories in Article 3 with respect to respect. Respect and dignity, respect for difference, and those terms, which I will, in a couple minutes, say is one of the most difficult challenges for indicator development, how to get an indicator for respect. European Social Survey does that. The lovely National Disability Survey of Ireland, which I also was privileged to help work on, uses the technique of saying you have a problem, well, why is it? What are you missing? What could you use? What could you need? So it's an environmental kind of question, and I'm skipping this. Okay, so the first problem, there are three challenges in disability data collection, and the first one is that we tend to have inappropriate data collection tools. The second problem is called my second joke. This joke is the most lovely joke on earth that I know of because it actually is a very academic joke, even though it doesn't, and it's also it's not funny, which makes it difficult to tell you this joke. You're walking out of a pub after a hard night of Guinness, and you come upon a person who is under a street light on the ground looking for something. And you come up to the fellow and say, I was going to do an Irish accent, but I couldn't. Anyway, you come up to this fellow and you say, well, what are you looking for? Oh, my contact lens. Oh, and you get on your hands and you walk around you look around for the contact lens, and then after all you say, are you sure you dropped it here? No, I dropped it over there in the dark, but it's so much more light here. That's a bit as much laughter as I've ever gotten from that joke, but it has this absolutely crucial lesson. The way statistics is done is you measure what's easy to measure, the stuff in the light. The stuff that's in the dark, where actually probably all the important stuff is, you don't measure because it's too dark. Now, the story is a story about validity and reliability, if you think about it, because the fellow in the light is engaged in an invalid pursuit that's highly reliable because the light's good. In the dark, it's valid but not reliable because it's dark. So what we need is to, and here's the metaphor, shine light on discrimination and attitudes, because then we'll be able to see what actually is causing it, and we'll have reliability and validity simultaneously. Now, this is a major problem. If you couple this with the cost of having expensive surveys and the fact that it costs more to identify the things that probably are more relevant than the things that are irrelevant, you end up with this. You end up with testing the effectiveness of policies in the CRPD with respect to employment by looking at employment rates. Now, you will never get the relevant information from an employment rate, but you can easily get the information because we collect it all the time. So what happens is the information that is available is used because it's available. Now, this little story is my criticism against Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, which is engaged with some other people to develop indicators for the convention. And I'll get to what an indicator is in a second, but the story doesn't rely on it, that are using existing data as the basis for determining what to measure. In other words, they're using what they have to determine what's relevant to the convention. Well, that's the wrong way around. You start with the convention, you determine what needs to be measured, and then you get the data from it. And unfortunately, because of costs and political problems, it's going the other way around. Okay, the third and last problem is disaggregated data, which I should explain here, but I do in 2 slides down. Disaggregation is the process of cross-tabulation. So you have employment rate. What's the employment rate? Well, if you have an employment rate, you know nothing about, for one thing, whether more women than men are employed. So you disaggregate the data in terms of gender. You separate the data, and then you discover, far more women are unemployed than men. Then you disaggregate it by disability, and then if you can, because you need information to do this, you then are able to say more people with disabilities are unemployed than people without disabilities. So having flat rates or indices or whatever device you use doesn't give you the grounds for saying people with disabilities have a higher unemployment rate than people without, therefore there's a chance of discriminatory action. At least you have some evidence of it. So disaggregation is absolutely fundamental, but it requires additional questions because you have to, if the survey has the possibility of internal disaggregation, the first part of the survey asks, are you a man or a woman? And then you answer the question, are you employed or not? Then you can use within the same questionnaire a disaggregation. Otherwise, you have to infer from other things. It's a challenge sometimes. Okay, so our challenge is to develop a true disability survey, one that is appropriate and captures the CRPD sense of disability, and to my mind, focuses on barriers in the environment and then looks at the effect of environmental barriers, attitudes, discriminatory practices, policies that penalize people for going to work instead of taking up certain forms of social assistance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the absence of lifts and buildings, all those things that focuses on that and then looks on the impact of participation by virtue of that. Then we would have data that we need and the disaggregation and another technical point which I'm skipping. The last, as if we didn't have enough challenge, we also have to make sure that the data is collected preserving privacy and confidentiality, and that we disseminate the data in an appropriate way.